You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello, Questers. This is Mandy, the host of Caster Quest, inviting you to enjoy our podcast where we explore the rich and vibrant world of Patrick Rothfuss's best-selling fantasy series, The Kingkiller Chronicle, soon to be adapted as a major motion picture and television show produced by the award-winning creator of Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda. Hungry for more content? Perhaps you will enjoy our recaps of HBO's Game of Thrones, Over the Garden Wall, animated Batman films, or our world-famous erotic fanfiction reads. Whatever you're in the mood for, if you love a good story, humor, impromptu parody songs, and thousands of pop culture references, you'll enjoy our show. You can find Caster Quest on SoundCloud, iTunes, and of course, our amazing network, the Earth Station One Network, at esopodcast.com.
Hello, and welcome again to the Monster Sci-Fi Show podcast. I am your host, The Monster, back to give you a delayed sci-fi news for last week coming out this week. So again, much apologies, but actually I was ill, and I came down with a bit of a cold that I finally kicked over the weekend and slept a lot. And last Thursday was when I was planning to record the full season review of Star Trek Discovery with Tony and David, which I had to cancel because, again, I was feeling really, really bad. And although you can hear me now and I sound okay, I'm feeling like I'm still a little bit nasally, so I do apologize if you hear that in my voice. But in any case, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was the return of Fangoria, the magazine, which is a fantastic horror magazine that I grew up reading. The other thing I wanted to talk about, something that I read about in which Sony had kind of the rights to a lot of these Marvel characters. And I want to talk about that in relation to the upcoming Venom, which the trailer came out as well. So it's a couple of things I want to talk about in relation to Sony and Venom and all that fun stuff. And lastly, I'm going to be talking about Shin Godzilla. Since I'm off today, I decided I'm finally catching up on something that I wanted to record many, many moons ago, and finally got to watch Shin Godzilla today. So I'm going to give you a review on that. So if you have not seen Shin Godzilla, I will be giving out spoilers, so don't listen to that last part of that. So I'll give you another warning when I get to that point. But right now, let's get into the return of Fangoria. As you may or may not have heard my past horror podcast, and I've talked about the horror genre being a big influence in my life. And again, there's a special person that credit that to, because she really got me into that horror genre. And because of that, just like with sci-fi, there was Starlog magazine, which I read every issue and wrote down notes about upcoming movies so I could have, an idea of what's coming on and be like what I do now. Back then, it was just me telling myself what's coming out and reading behind-the-scenes stuff. But the horror stuff, Fangoria was that magazine. There was no other magazine that's on the market. I mean, I would say maybe like Famous Monsters would be kind of like that, but Famous Monsters was more of the classic past horror movies. And it's fine for what it is, and I still love it. But Fangoria, we're talking about gore stuff. If you can think about it, back in the day when this came out, which I was reading up back in 1979, so it hit the perfect sweet spot for me because the 80s had one of the best, fantastic horror movies in that period. And the best one that comes to mind would be John Carpenter's The Thing. And I remember reading Fangoria and Rob Bottin's work, which is he was the actual physical makeup artist and creature designer for The Thing. And it's just so fantastic to get that kind of behind the scenes view of a movie that I really loved. So to have this magazine come back, and I think they, again, in the reading that I was doing, the last physical issue was 2015, so it's not that far off that it's not that relevant. But in this day and age, it's really hard to figure out, is a magazine, a physical magazine, worth it, or you just remain digital, or you don't bother coming back at all. Wizards of the Coast magazines was one of my favorites, and unfortunately they're gone altogether. Starlog, went by the way of the dodo, unfortunately. I still love Starlog, but you can read a lot of that information on other people's blogs or other websites that has the exact same information. So to really promote the brand of Fangoria, they're looking to produce movies as well as doing podcasting as well as horror novels. So think of it what like the Sci-Fi channel started to do. You had a Sci-Fi channel and they started producing their own movies or having movies that are specific to that channel. And I do remember there were books under the Sci-Fi channel, the original SCIFI logo, the Sci-Fi channel, not the SYFY stuff, so which is crap. But in any case, I'm kind of excited to get back into that horror genre. And again, I've produced, I think, 4 or 5 different podcasts in which I talk about movies from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. And then I gave my top 10 favorite horror movies of all time. Since then, I haven't really gotten into horror movies in a very long time. The exception would be zombies or the Godzilla movies that will come out every once in a while, which is not really horror, but it's, you get what I mean. So I would love to go back into that world and re-explore something that I really loved. And hopefully I will find more joy and more hidden gems that I would like to add to my collection. So I'm kind of eager to see how that turns out. And again, I want to update my horror Halloween podcast because every Halloween I re-release those podcasts and I make it available. And it does get played out, but I really want to get a little bit more up-to-date information. It's nice to rely on old memories, but I really would like to see what else is being done out there today. Not several decades old. So, all right. So let's move on to the story that I was reading. There's an upcoming book called The Big Picture, The Fight for the Future of Movies, written by Ben Fritz. And of course, me being a librarian, I'm like, oh, this is something that we should plan for and at least order, because the snippet that they gave out that back in the late 90s, Marvel was in a financial strap. This is way before they started having the Marvel Disney MCU franchise. This is before even Marvel was producing their own stuff, which is like the Incredible Hulk stuff. So before then, they wanted to give out the license to their movies. So, Sony was, all right, fine. But the only thing that I want from you is Spider-Man. They didn't want anything to do with Iron Man, Thor, Ant-Man, Black Panther, and all of that, plus more characters, for $25 million. So, in light of the release of the Black Panther movie, which made well over $200 million in its opening weekend, they dropped the ball big time. So what do they do? Let's use whatever characters that we have in that Spider-Verse But yet, let's not make it a Spider-Verse. We're going to introduce Venom. Okay? So we have Tom Hardy as Venom. And they're not going to talk or at least introduce Spider-Man at all. I'm not sure if they're going to make any kind of references, but from the trailer that I saw, which honestly, I was kind of like, that's it? I was really bored watching this trailer because nothing happened. Really, nothing happened. If we go with the comics, which, these movies sometimes stick to, in this case, I don't think that's what's going to happen. The black Spider-Man costume came from the Secret Wars comics. And basically, it turned out to be a symbiont, which is called Venom. And basically, it's a second skin that acted on Peter's evil side. And they picked up on that basically in the third Spider-Man movie, which you had that storyline in which there is no Secret Wars, but a meteor coming down to Earth, landing in Central Park, which happens to be where Mary Jane and Peter Parker were hanging out. And lo and behold, something comes out of that meteorite and attaches to Peter's bike, and then he becomes this new Dark Spider-Man. Fine. I can live without the Secret Wars comics and go with that. Addition of the Venom character, in which if you had left Sandman alone, it would have been fine, because it was going back to the first movie and retelling the death of Uncle Ben, which I thought was kind of interesting, but adding on the addition of Venom, which is more of, again, Sony's play, really kind of mucked things up and really turned off Sam Raimi to do any further Spider-Man movies. But having said that, fine, we go forward. How are you going to introduce Venom without the at least mention of Spider-Man? Well, I watched a movie a week ago called Life, and it came out in 2017, and this is with Jake Gyllenhaal and Ryan Reynolds. This takes place on the space station, which is kind of similar to like what I was thinking about with the Cloverfield paradox. Oh, another story taking place on a space station. And I looked at it and I'm like, it's okay. In fact, I actually thought Cloverfield Paradox was a much better movie than this. Now, the only thing that I would give to Life is, again, if you have not seen it, the spoiler is there are two survivors, Jake Gyllenhaal and one other astronaut. The idea was for Jake to have this creature that they got from Mars and keep it in the escape pod and basically override the controls that instead of going to Earth, it will go fling out into space and then die or freeze, whatever. The other astronaut will just re-enter back to Earth because it's already pre-programmed. Because there was so much debris, the two of them almost got into an accident and hit debris that kind of misfired some of the ship's calculations going back to Earth. So at one point, you weren't sure which ship was going out to space and the other one was going back to Earth, which you find out it's Jake Gyllenhaal, and basically the creature is basically living through him and makes it back to Earth. So that would have been a really smart and clever way of introducing the Venom character, letting him be this separate story, arriving to Earth, kind of giving a really good prologue to Venom. It would be really, really, really smart if they do that, but I doubt that will be the case. But I don't know how to make Venom out. It is coming out in October. I want to be hopeful that this is something that is not going to be a miss. But then again, there's an idea of also expanding that again, Spider-Verse or the Spider-Man universe of other characters without Spider-Man in there. I'm like, I don't know how you should be doing this. I think you should be using Spider-Man as a point to launch other titles, Kind of like how you did, let's say, I don't know, Captain America and Civil War, and how you had Black Panther in there. And then, lo and behold, a couple of years later, we have a Black Panther movie. I'm always of the belief that if you're going to introduce new heroes, you don't necessarily have to do a separate movie and do an origin story just to have that universe set. You can have them in an established movie, in this case, Spider-Man, and that being the jumping off point. And again, I'm taking my reactions from the first trailer for Venom, and it doesn't do anything that it gets me excited. And it's worrisome that Sony thinks they can now, I don't want to play with a big mouse, but it's going to have to do a lot of heavy lifting in order to get their universe moving the way Marvel is doing it with Disney. So, all right. So enough of that shenanigans. Now I'm going to talk about Shin Godzilla. So again, as I mentioned, I'm going to be giving spoilers. So if you have not seen Shin Godzilla, then stop right now. If you have, then let's have that discussion now. So this came out in 2016, and this is stuck in Japan, basically. I think it was released through Funimation last year or in August of last year, which I have not seen like anywhere, like on Netflix or on Hulu or anything like that. Nothing that I can see this locally on my end. So it was kind of like frustrating to have that, considering we had, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the Godzilla Planet of Monsters, which was on Netflix, and we did a review on that. So I'm like, come on, I love the Big Chi, and I want to see every single one of them. And this was kind of a struggle trying to find something to watch this from that source. So again, finally got this done. And I always wondered about the initial design, because so all I had was just pictures and a trailer, which of course wasn't subtitled, it wasn't dubbed, but it had this kind of music going on, shots of Godzilla, or at least parts of it, intercut with people either walking through hallways or in meetings, and back to Godzilla's parts, and more meetings and more destruction, nothing else. So when I watched the movie, it's kind of like that. I mean, sure, we get some destruction from a thing that looks like not Godzilla. But let me start off with this. If you have not seen I think within the first 15 minutes, this creature that is evolving, it's hideous and it's disgusting. And I'm not the kind of guy that I'm like, oh, I'm squeamish. No, there is a point in which Godzilla is kind of, he doesn't have his front arms, right? So he just have back legs, and he's kind of pushing his whole body on the floor, like wiggling. But then there are gills on the side of him that are kind of open. So anytime he kind of wiggles, all his blood's kind of splashing out. And it's really, ew. And I'm not squeamish, but it was really disgusting. And the thing is, Godzilla's eyes were always wide open. It would never blink. So it had this weird newborn feel. And it was just like, it was really disgusting to me to watch. So after a while, it starts to evolve. It starts to walk upright somewhat. And then I figured out why, this massive creature has these tiny little arms, because he's still evolving, and I thought maybe he has some kind of radiation poisoning, because you would see these shots of him with cracks in his skin with red kind of peering out. And I'm like, oh, maybe it's like the radiation is getting to him and he just can't contain it and he's falling apart. But now it's not the case. He's evolving from the radiation. So One of the problems that you would have with any Godzilla movies is that you have to have the people element dealing with this. So what do they always do? Well, let's break out the army. We'll send the jets. We'll fire on it and we'll hope for the best. And of course, that never happens. That never works out because he's invincible and destroys your city in the process. So the other thing to take away from all this is that this is a reboot of Godzilla. So if you think about the Godzilla from 1953. Again, I'm blanking out here. But the original Godzilla movie, they were able to stop him at the end. And ever since then, Godzilla basically has not been able to have been stopped, at least through man's measures of combating him. But in this movie, we're looking at basically it's a single creature, and it's just him and the city fighting against a man. All the other Godzilla movies since then will have another creature that he would have to fight, but there would always be either people involved in a backstory or somewhere in the process with Godzilla that whatever, it has to flesh out the story. But here, if you look at the original versus this one, the major difference, that Godzilla was shot at night. This one, you see a lot of it in the daytime. There are certain shots here that I am just so amazed by how photorealistically it looks at the cityscape in relation to the city that it's destroying. It is beautiful. If there is a word to could describe this destruction that he is causing and just menacing around that city, it is beautiful. It's amazing, and I give him credit for it. Whereas the original Godzilla, menacing and all that and destructive, a lot of those shots were done at night, so it's easy to kind of hide a lot of things that you would normally not be able to do during the daytime. So a big difference from that movie to this movie. Now, the other thing is that the beginning, 40 minutes, there's a lot of, what's that? And a lot of reaction to that thing on the screen. Or, we got to evacuate the city. Let's call the press conference. Let's have another meeting. What's that on the screen? It's evolving. So it's a lot of people and a lot of meetings going on and people walking through the hallways, like you saw in the trailers. I'm like, God, it's really slow. I'd say at the hour and 10 minutes, because you still have another half hour to go, that's when it starts to get interesting. Because that's when we get, of course, the traditional, let's fire our tanks and get our helicopters and planes and whatever and fire. Nothing. But Godzilla is a little bit more different than I've seen before. And I think pretty much different in every respect. One of the things that he is able to do is that he laid waste to this one city, and he basically, if you remember Blade 2, the vampire that ate other vampires, its mouth not only opened wide, but also unhinged the front. Godzilla kind of almost does that. And while he's breathing fire down on this city, it gets to be a point and becomes like a laser. And then he starts picking off the ships out from the sky easily. And then all of a sudden, his back, the dorsal fin, starts shooting out lasers in multiple angles, and it's like, holy crap, I've never saw that before. So, if you remember Godzilla in the animated series, he shot lasers from his eyes. Did he shoot lasers from his eyes? Yes, he did. Now I have to check myself. Yeah, he shot lasers from his eyes. I had to, I had to Google a shot. Yeah, because the animated stuff, you could never have fire. Why? That's what he does. He breathes fire. But it's a kid's show, so you can't do fire. It's not like when you do the Fantastic Four and you have Johnny Storm. Why he's not in there? Because he's on fire. So why? We can't have him. What are we going to do? Stick a robot in that show and call him Herbie so he'll become the new Fantastic Four. Bullcrap. So going back to Godzilla animated series, he doesn't breathe fire. He just shoots lasers from his eyes. Really? All right. Going back to the movie. He's shooting lasers out of his body everywhere. His mouth and his back. Amazing. So I'm like, that's not going to be good because I don't see how anything is going to be able to stop this creature. Again, this is just one creature. It's just Godzilla. So they come up with a plan. These are the people that are in the meetings, in the hallway, looking at footage, looking at data, and they come up with an idea. Albeit, as that's going on, the U.S. is coming up with a plan to drop a thermonuclear bomb on Tokyo. So for a third time, and it was like, oh, that's not good considering what you guys did almost 50 plus years ago. So that was an interesting line or an interesting consequence that was going to happen to Tokyo. But luckily it didn't happen. Why? Because the plan was they were going to use some kind of coagulate to his blood. And of course, you can't really fire on him. So how is this going to be administered? Well, you lift up Godzilla's little tail and then you stick your hand up his... No, you're not going to do that. You're not going to give him an enema. So forget that. And besides, he already had his prostate checked about 3 months ago. So the whole idea was, how can you get Godzilla to stay put? Well, luckily, somehow, after he expended himself all over the city, he kind of took a nap. Not that he had to take a cigarette break or anything like that, but he kind of froze in place because I guess he was spent. He did his business all over the city. So they had calculated how long until he was able to regain himself or regain back to consciousness. So they came up with a game plan, which I'm like, okay, how are they going to manage with whatever weapons they have? Well, again, the idea was to use the city as a weapon for Godzilla. So, at one point, you had these trains there because he's like over a bridge, and these trains are underneath him, and they were loaded with explosives. So they were going to kind of wake him up that way with the trains hitting him, and then as he is awake, they were going to explode the buildings that are around him and like basically keep him down. Then they load in a couple of tankers filled with this chemical in which they're going to inject him. So when his mouth is open, they use these long cranes to kind of inject the chemical inside his mouth. Of course, he wakes up, burns them, but then something else happens in which he gets another laser out of his tail. So now he's firing the laser from his mouth and from his tail. So I'm like, holy crap. I love Godzilla, and I love what they've done with his new powers. So that's amazing, and that's frightening. So I don't see how this is going to be ending anytime soon on a good note. But they did this again, and they were able to knock him down again and able to finally inject the rest of the serum. And basically, he is frozen now in place. So I'm like, but what about global warming? That's going to be a thing, and they're going to defrost him. But basically, it's going to reduce him in size and shrinkage over a couple of years. So he won't exist in a couple of years. But in the meantime, they were able to successfully stop Godzilla in his tracks, literally. And again, if you look at this movie and you see Godzilla in the distance and it's in the daytime and it's just so photorealistic, it's amazing. It is absolutely amazing. And the thing, I'm like thinking, like, this is like that hotel that they built in Japan, where you have Godzilla on the outside. So I wouldn't be surprised if they start building around him. And then, of course, that will be for nothing because he'll destroy it if he doesn't get shrunk down. But in any case, I was actually happy with Shin Godzilla. So finally, I got to be happy with a reboot that kind of gave a one-up to people kind. You know, mankind actually won in this case. And which goes back to what happened in the first movie, the one that were able to strip out the air from the water. So since that was for Godzilla back then, this case they were able to freeze him internally and use that as their victory. So there is no morality about because of the atomic age, Godzilla was born from this. In this case, it's a thing because of radioactivity, but it doesn't really get connected like it did in the past. And I don't think it needs to. It just needs to be, this thing happened, this thing did this, and now it's that. It's kind of dead, but it's frozen. So, and that's fine. I'm just curious to see what is going to happen in the future. If this Godzilla remains the same, if it continues shrinking, then it becomes like a smaller Godzilla. Please don't let it be a Godzuki. But it did say something to the effect at one point that it was self-mutating. So at one point it could have generated smaller versions of itself, or at least maybe gotten wings, and then off it goes, and then you got all that stuff. Which, when I was thinking about that, oh, maybe that is what happened in the Godzilla Planet of the Monsters, because we see a smaller version of Godzilla, which we thought, thinking that's the original one. It's not. Until we see the huge one, the monster, the super, super bigger Godzilla. And maybe that's what happened. Because that planet, he was able to self-mutate and generate other creatures like himself. So I'm curious to see how that plays out, because we still got 2 more episodes on that. But again, Shin Godzilla, I recommend this for any of us who love the Big G. I don't think the kids will like it as much if you're wanting to share this with your family, because again, there's a lot of meetings in the beginning, and except for a couple of moments in the very beginning, which I thought again was grossed out. I think you're okay. But really, the last 30 minutes, like in any Godzilla movie, that's when everything happens. And I was happy with it. I was really happy with it. So, all right. I'm going to end the podcast on that note. I got a couple of other podcasts to work on, including rewatching Black Panther with Mr. Gene, and hopefully record a podcast with him as well as with my wife. So that's going to be an interesting podcast. So, on that note, you can always email me at monsterscifishow@gmail.com. So please email me any of your comments, your thoughts. If you've seen Shin Godzilla, please, I would love to know what your thoughts are about that. You can always follow me on the various social networks. So again, thank you for listening to me and to the Monster Sci-Fi Show podcast. It's sci-fi from a certain point of view. Good night.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network, your station for all things geek, classic, current, and beyond. Be part of the crew at ESONetwork.com.